Good morning. First challenge of the day, what is still water and what is flat water? I messed this up once for a talk, and I was drinking in the middle of my talk, and it was like, there's bubbles in this, and it was the most frightening thing I've ever seen. That's the best humor you'll get today, so if you're not happy with that, you're in trouble. So it's 9 a.m. Clearly want to get everything started out. It's such an early hour with very bright topic conversation. So we're going to talk about firing people. That was the best humor I had today. It's funny because firing people is bad, theoretically. But that's what we're going to talk about today. I think it's kind of interesting to talk about because we don't talk about it. I think it's a really important aspect of our industry that we just don't really cover. And that's what I want to start with. So I'm Zach Holman. I worked at GitHub for a while, and now I'm looking for my next journey. You've heard people talk like that before, right? Just weird euphemisms. They're on their journey. They're going to do all these sorts of things next, and they don't talk about, getting fired, because that would be weird. It's such like a weird euphemistic way of putting things. It's like, if Kanye West did like an iPhone voiceover ad or something like that, we're going to be on a journey with this new iPhone because it's dope. It's really weird. So it's weird. I don't understand why I get why we do these euphemisms, like on a journey, I'm going to spend more time with my family, I'm going to go do a bunch of blow in Vegas or something. But it's really weird that we have these euphemisms when we talk about these experiences. A lot of people compare a job with a relationship, which I think is wholly unhealthy, but sometimes it's kind of interesting to think about, particularly with regards towards leaving a job. When you break up with somebody, typically you'll say stuff like, we weren't right for each other, or I didn't really see this going somewhere, or, it just wasn't, what I wanted out of a relationship. Stuff like that. They never say, oh, man, you broke up in a relationship? That's weird. You must be a terrible human. That's a weird thing, but that's what we talk about when it comes to jobs. So I find that kind of fascinating. Jobs, it doesn't have to be that way. Sometimes it's just a normal part of the career that people may have. For an industry that prides itself on being very, open, we'll get into the really hard conversations, like how much better is Vim than Emacs? The answer is a lot. People talk about weird stuff like this, but we don't talk about firing. We'll talk about hiring sometimes, but we don't talk about this stuff, which is why I want to talk about it. So I'm Zach Holman. GitHub fired me last year. We'll start from here. For context, I apologize, I am an American. This is unfortunate because we don't have things like healthcare, worker-friendly laws, a civil discourse in society, things like that. And it's unfortunate. This talk is necessarily US-centric. And I'm sorry for that, but that's kind of my experience. But the interesting part is how universal a lot of these concepts are. The first time I gave this talk was in the UK, where I kind of assumed that, the vaunted Brits have everything fantastic for the people. And then after I gave the talk, there were a lot of people who are like, no, if they want to fire you, they will find ways of pushing you out the door, getting you to quit, getting around the law and stuff. So it's really remarkable how, even if you necessarily have the laws to protect you, sometimes the laws don't protect you. In my case, it's kind of the far extreme end of the spectrum. I'm based in San Francisco. I'm in California. California has at-will employment, which means that if I walk into work and I'm wearing the wrong color shoes, they can fire me. There's a lot of reasons for this, but it's kind of the far end of the spectrum of they don't necessarily need a reason as long as it's not gender-based or racist or something like that. So I'm sorry for making this US specific. Half the time I'm outside of the States, I'm apologizing for my country, so I'll just continue that. I'm almost past my quotas today, and we'll start with that. I want everybody to talk about this more. I think we need to start fixing some of these problems. I think there's some really interesting concepts to discover. I think this is something we can all do. Even though not everyone is going to be a manager, not everyone is going to be fired, hopefully, there's a lot of things like how this impacts us as coworkers, as friends. So that's what I want you to think about during this talk. I'm going to come at it from 3 different perspectives. One is from your perspective. If you get fired, this talk may be interesting for you. the count is now up to like 12 or 14 people who have seen one of my talks or blog posts about this subject, and then in subsequent months they got fired, and then they were like, oh, I really appreciate your talk now. So what I'm trying to say is someone in this room is about to get fired and they don't know about it. So, look around and point fingers if you know who it is. No one. So that'll be one part. I'll come from your perspective, what to do in that situation. The other one is from the employer perspective, because I know a lot of people are managers, may be managers, may start companies in the future. And I think there's a lot of interesting things, A, to protect the company when you have to let somebody go, and B, just to make things easier for the person you have to let go. Like, it doesn't have to be one-sided. Like, you can help out both sides of the table in doing this. So there's a lot of tips I have about that. And finally, the perspective that not a lot of people talk about is the coworker perspective. If I'm working on a team and my teammate gets fired, or lets go, or even quits, how do I react to it? What different sorts of things can I do to make this whole process a lot better? So I'll talk about that perspective as well. So those three perspectives, and hopefully we'll learn about firing a little bit more. First of all, can everyone see my slides? If it's too small, like I'll zoom in or something like that. I'm just jazzed up. I was trying to think of like something funny I could put on my slide, just that it's 14 stories tall or something. I didn't think of anything, but it's one of my disappointments in life. First of all, I want to talk about the backstory a little bit about myself, how I went through my story, and then we'll kind of expand from there. So I'm Zach Holman, Holman on Twitter, Holman on GitHub, Holman on GitLab, Holman on social media things. I was at GitHub from 2010 to 2015, so about 5 years, which is ancient in Silicon Valley, terrible working conditions era or something. It was a decent long time. I was number 9 at GitHub when I left. It was like 250, 275, something like that. It's been growing a lot. It was a very different company by the time I left. And even today, they have 600 employees, which blows my mind at this point. I saw a lot of changes in the company as I went. And this talk is about my story, and I apologize for that. I don't tend to really want to give a talk about myself because it's weird, and I really don't want to give a talk about something like getting fired because that's really bad. But I don't know how to give a talk like this in the abstract. I can't just say like, oh yeah, don't do this, and whatever. It's a lot easier for me to say like, okay, don't do this because this is how it impacted me. It really sucked. Here's how you can change this in the future. And the other aspect about this is, I think my example is a very extreme example. I think that's kind of helpful to learn from. I was at GitHub for a long time. I was involved with GitHub for a long time. I did a bunch of these talks for GitHub and promoted GitHub, and I was kind of the face of GitHub for a while. And then I was kind of let go within the span of like 4 days. So it's a very extreme example, but I think that makes it a lot easier to sort of learn from. So that's kind of the perspective of this whole talk. So first of all, the lead up into all of this sort of stuff. I think when I first did this talk, I've done it once in February and once in June. And I titled this slide Burnout, because I felt very burnt out. It was very difficult after spending 5 years on one product to really be really jazzed up about the next thing. And I think, in hindsight, a lot of this is just also depression I was dealing with. So it was kind of a tie between burnout, depression, and dealing with, just the same old stuff for whatever reason wasn't working before. I just finished GitHub Issues. It was my last real ship there, the current version of GitHub Issues that you all probably use at this point, and that was like a big push, and I was kind of fried with everything. And I realized that like, it had been 5 years and I hadn't really taken a vacation. Like I'd been places, I've done things, but I always had my phone out, checking Twitter, checking the customer support stuff, working on code on the side. And that was cool for a while, but it just wasn't, I didn't get the benefits of an actual vacation from it. So it really ended up, playing a toll on my, whole psyche and stuff. So I was talking to one of the founders about all this sort of stuff, and he suggested a sabbatical, taking some time off, and that's what I ended up doing. And it ended up being great, kind of a nice time to reset. If your company allows you to take a sabbatical or even just an extended vacation, highly suggest it. It's a good way to sort of just reboot your system and come at the problem from a different perspective. So I did that. It took a couple months off, And then February, I was like, of last year, I was like, okay, I'm gonna attack this. I'm pretty stoked. Let's get back to shipping stuff, right? Rewinding it, right before I went on my sabbatical, I talked to the CEO, and he's like, oh, my preference would be for you to stay at GitHub. When you come back, would be totally up to you. I was like, okay, cool, that's fine. I want to come back, ready to tear things up. And then by the time I was ready to come back, my manager sent me another email saying, before agreeing to your return, we need to chat through some things. And I was like, oh, that's kind of a tell. Interesting. That's not in the guidelines. So from your perspective, when you start seeing stuff like this, read the clues. If they start moving the goalposts, going from like, oh, do this, oh, now we actually wanted you to do this, that may start, hitting some warning bells in your head. I showed this email to kind of one of my mentors who had done everything before, and he just took one read of it, and he was just like, yeah, that's when they started to fire you. And I was like, really? I mean, they just wanted to talk. Like, I don't know what's, the real reason behind this. And he was like, no, I know, because I've fired a lot of people the same way, and also people have done this exact same thing to me when they fired me from, kicking me out of my own company. I was like, okay, interesting, fascinating. All right, I should have thought that through earlier. So I had a conversation with my manager. At the time, I was in Colorado instead of at home in San Francisco. So we did like we were like, okay, we should do a quick Skype chat just to kind of get things through, because I wanted to get back to work. I was pretty stoked about it. So this is the first chat I had with my manager in 4 months, because she had decided that we didn't need one-on-ones. That's kind of also a red flag. If your manager stops managing, it's probably not good, or it's just weird. So we have like a conversation with me and my manager, and then someone in HR. Like, surprise, there's somebody on the line. I was like, oh, that's interesting. As a pro tip, HR doesn't normally join one-on-ones for fun. Like, they're not sitting around just thinking like, oh, what should I be doing today? Oh, I'm just gonna like sit in some random conversation. Like, no, there's a reason why they did this, which is still weird to me, but. As one might expect, the conversation turned immediately confrontational. I was just like, yeah, I want to get back to work, and she was like, we got to make sure you're ready to be a, competent, collaborative, whatever C word of the company again, or something like that. And I was like, okay, cool. And she's like, no, are you really ready? And I was like, I'm really confused here, and it turned really weird. So then after all of this sort of stuff, like, she ended up calling me an asshole a couple of times in front of HR, which I thought was pretty fucked up. So I made my first real mistake, and I filed a HR complaint. I was like, this is kind of fucked up. I want to move teams. I made like my third request to like just move me to any other team. I would be happy that. Cool. So number 2, just avoid HR. If you're an employee, and like, yeah, it's funny, but it's also really kind of sad. This is kind of a bad thing to say, but it's definitely the truth. Like, as an employee, HR does not exist to help you. They will go to extreme lengths. They will go to lengths to help you as long as it doesn't come at the cost of the company. And that's like the end of the day. Like, HR exists to protect the company, not you. And this is particularly true for marginalized groups, or if you were, like, women, for example, there's scores of stories where they've experienced sexism in the workplace. They report it, and then they're the ones that get fired, which is completely fucked up. So that's one of those things where, like, yeah, HR is cool, and usually the company will tell you, oh, if you have a problem with whatever, go to HR, but it's not for you. Keep that in mind. From an employer perspective, number 1, just avoid surprises. The weird part about giving a talk like this is that I've heard dozens and dozens and dozens of stories from other people who have been in similar situations and stuff. And the ones that are the most raw and the most hurtful are the ones where they're like, yeah, I didn't know I was doing bad. Like, all of a sudden I'm out. Like, this is really fucked up. And it's kind of a bad practice if anybody who's getting fired doesn't know that if the writing wasn't on the wall. I just had a friend who got fired a couple weeks ago, and he was like, he finally was in a one-on-one with his manager, and the manager's like, okay, so you've been not performing well since 2014. And he was like, what? Like, you should have told me about this. Like, I could have done something. And they're like, no, but you can transition out if you want to. Here's your severance and stuff. And he was just like, wow. At no point should any like organization have any surprises. Like, you should at least let people know as you go around. And this is mostly just from a human standpoint. Like, if you're about to get fired or let go or forced out or whatever, it's nice to know ahead of time so you can start planning or start changing your behavior. And a lot of companies will do PIPs, like performance improvement plans. There's a bunch of other names for this. This is a way of saying, okay, we don't think you're up to snuff right now, and we want you to, work really hard on these 3 goals over the next 2 months or something. And if not, we're going to fire you. These are typically like, I just sat down with somebody from IBM, and he was like, yeah, if I put somebody on a PIP, I'm going to fire them 95% of the time. So it typically means you're on your way out, but that gives you 2 things. One, you can work hard to try and change your behavior and do better if that's what you want to do. Or 2, you can start on your resume, start interviewing, start networking and stuff, so you can be better prepared for when the inevitability does come. So I think that's at least helpful to get that communication going both ways to, again, avoid surprises. So back in my world, I was in Colorado. I flew to San Francisco to have a meeting that Wednesday. Got pushed to Friday or something. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to meet the CEO. We're going to hash this out and figure out like what the hell's happening. Then I got fired. First thing I did once I walked in the room, the CEO was like, "Oh, you're not going to be happy here," which is definitely a euphemism because my happiness at the company is not the company's business and stuff. It's about like performance and everything. But it's all right because euphemisms are a lot easier to sort of deal with this sort of stuff. I think at the time it ended up being I was probably vocal about the culture and the lack of product work that had been going on in the company for some time. And there I was probably axed as they were moving towards a different organizational structure and stuff like that. Which it happens as the company grows. Again, like we used to put the entire company on the same table, and with 250, 275 people, like that's quite a bit different at that point. So that's fine. We did the firing thing, and like we gave each other hugs at the end of it, and it was all cool and stuff. As much as that can be, I guess. Yeah, and that was interesting. Then I was fired. If this is you, if you've done this before, or you think you may be one of the people who's about to get fired in this room, first thing you should do is just chill. That's my #1 suggestion. There's very little you can do right now. Like in football, when somebody like picks up a yellow card, and the first thing they do is like, "That's not. No, I didn't do that foul. Like that's ridiculous." The ref has never ever gone, "Oh shit, yeah, you're right. Like put that away. Yellow on the other team because yeah, whatever." I can't imagine there's a lot of people who have been fired and then immediately was able to persuade the people to unfire them or something. I'm sure it happens, but it's not going to happen. And like it's they hold all the cards. They obviously run the company, and you are now out of it. So just like take a breath, take a seat, and try not to do any like bargaining. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything in the room if you can, because even though I had like probably a pretty decent, respectful end of my termination and stuff, you're definitely not in your right mindset. What do they say in Star Trek? Like, I was emotionally compromised. Spock, whatever. I had a good joke about watching Star Trek on this movie screen earlier, but I forgot about it. So that was my Star Trek reference. But yeah, you don't have to necessarily. Sometimes they'll make you like sign your separation agreement and stuff in the room, but usually you can say, hey, can I get some time? I want to actually review this, figure out what I'm actually signing, make some decisions for myself, stuff like that. The more you can delay on this stuff, the better. And as long as you're respectful about it, I think most reasonable companies will say, okay, we'll give you a week or a couple weeks or whatever to sit through this and figure this stuff out. At the end of the day, like you have to remember, even if you are a terrible human being, you're probably only going to get fired like a max of 2 or 3 times every decade or something, if that. Like it's unlikely you're going to be an expert at getting fired, probably. Although I guess I am at this point, but you're up against people who probably, depending on the company size, they may fire somebody every week or every month or something like that. So they're very good at what they're doing, and you have just lost your livelihood, and you're like, oh God, what the hell do I do next? So take some time and delay any sort of big decisions right away. From an employer's perspective, #1, especially in the tech community, I think the first thing you have to do is just lock down everything. I don't think that's an insult to the person you just let go. I think it just makes sense to like, okay, you're out of the organization. We're going to revoke all of your credentials, passwords and stuff like that. I think that's totally reasonable. And try to automate this as much as possible. Like the last thing you want to do to some poor sap at your company is say, okay, we just let go like 6 of your friends. Now you have to manually delete their access all day. Like nobody wants to do that job. But if you can just type a quick check command and then everyone's gone, it's like poof, it never really happened. But it's actually like a good thing. The more effective you can make this process, the more structured and business respectful you can make it, the better it is for everybody else. Also, take care to understand the actual implications you have by removing someone's access to something. Early on, Dropbox, before Dropbox had a split between like corporate accounts and personal accounts, there's a story I heard of someone got fired from a job. It happens. They removed their Dropbox access to the corporate account, which also deleted his personal Dropbox account, which also deleted his wedding photos from like 2 weeks prior or something like that. So then he got fired, and then he had to email the company back like, yeah, can I get my pictures back or something like that? Like, it was kind of a terrible situation. Like, Dropbox has fixed this, but it's still worthwhile to think from the perspective of someone who's leaving the company, either voluntarily or forcefully. Think through like what are the contexts of like, oh, do they need access to this random account for whatever else that they might do in the near-term future. It's also worthwhile to think about the real-world implications of letting somebody go. So this is a fictional thought experiment. If in your office you have like key fobs instead of like actual metal keys to get into your office, if that's the case, like do you deactivate the key fob when somebody is in the room getting fired? If that's the case, do you have like a multi-floor office, and is it possible that the person got fired on the 3rd floor, went to go get their stuff on the 2nd floor, found out their key fob was disabled, and were locked inside your office in the stairwell, and then they had to text message one of their fucking coworkers and said, hey, can you open the door? I got fired. My key fob doesn't work. It's really awkward. Don't do that. That happened to me. It's really angering. I'm just kidding. It was really funny. It was the funniest thing that happened all day. I was just like, God damn it, I'm locked in the office. What do I do now? I could have like made a song or something like that, made millions. But anyway, think through like the real world implications of like key access and stuff, or access to different personnel and that they may have to deal with, like insurance and stuff later on. Interesting to think about. And finally, just like refine this workflow. It's tech people like to deal with, how do I constantly improve the process and stuff like that. Again, like the clearer you can make this process for the people exiting the company, the better it is, the more stable everything feels. If it's kind of just like all over the place, you have no idea. And that's like the other reason to keep a good relationship going with the person who is exiting the company, because sometimes things happen. Like when I left GitHub, I still had access to a couple of production systems, so I just emailed security. I'm like, hey, add this to your checklist, remove these access, stuff like that. I still have access to a lot of GitHub's properties and web analytics. I've tried many times to get somebody to stop me from seeing the stuff, but such is life, I guess. So if you ever want to know what GitHub's traffic is doing right now, I'm just kidding. Reg, I'm just kidding. Legally, I'm just kidding. Reg is giving the closing keynote later today. He did this tweet a while ago. I've fired people, it was brutal. I've been fired, it's worse. So managers, please never solicit sympathy for the pain of firing people. I think that's important to keep in mind. Like, yeah, it does suck to fire people. But keep in mind that like you still have a job and stuff like that. There's some people who kind of say the flippant, like, oh yeah, it was so hard today, I had to like let somebody go, it was weird. On the other token, like one of the stories I heard after giving this talk, this kid who was probably like 22 or something, somehow he got in charge of a team, and he said like up until he read my post, he didn't really understand what getting fired was, because he'd never been fired. So he would fire people, and then on their way out, he'd be like, yo, high five. And he's like, they didn't high five me. And I was like, that was really weird. And then I started thinking about it, like this is 4 or 5 years later or something. And he's like, holy shit, I was a huge asshole. Like, I should have figured that stuff out. So yeah, like just think things through and realize this is potentially a big deal in their lives. Maybe not. Maybe they're only there for a couple weeks or something. Not a big deal. But it's still like a reasonable thing to kind of think through and realize that, like, put yourself in somebody else's shoes. From a coworker's perspective, this is kind of the first real thing you can do as somebody else on your team, maybe gets let go or even quits or something like that. First thing I would suggest is to determine the rationale. Ask around, ask your manager. I think it's totally fine to figure out, like, okay, why did this person end up leaving? Why is this person ended up getting terminated? Because it's helpful in your particular situation, like, okay, I have a team of 12 people, 6 people just got axed. What does that mean for my project? Am I screwed? Should I be preparing my resume? Or is it more of a, oh yeah, they were terrible, we want more people like you? This is an important thing to figure out, like, okay, are you on good ground or not? Part of this is gossip. I mean, gossip is terrible, blah, 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 but it's also kind of helpful sometimes to try and figure out, like, oh, what was the real reason behind this person? Did they chat too much in the chat room and that was annoying or something? Or, like, take it with a grain of salt, clearly, but it's still important to figure out, like, for your own sake, what is happening around you, so you can help defend your own position and be proactive about that. From an employer standpoint, just be truthful internally. It's definitely a hard process, but everyone beneath you, if you're like in a leadership position, they're going to figure it out anyway. So I got the copy of the email that was sent after I was fired. And it was, we had a very honest, productive conversation with Zach this morning, decided it was best to part ways. That was what my manager had sent out. And I'm like, manager, you weren't even in the room. Like, it wasn't an honest and productive conversation because, we didn't both mutually assure to part ways because otherwise I'd still be there. It was just kind of a weird thing and surreal thing to say. Like, I know they're trying to, like, save face internally, but that was not the right way to do it. And that's one of those things where, like, lying poisons the well for any future stuff and down the pipe. If you know that in the past they were very not as truthful, what do you say when something bigger happens as the company grows and stuff? So it's worth to just be truthful about this stuff. There's certainly things that you don't want to break people's privacy and get into details and stuff, but it's worthwhile to be as honest as you can within reason. The other aspect behind all of this that I think is kind of interesting to think about is group firing. And this can happen a number of times where, sometimes a company, definitely as it gets older, they may fire a number of people all at once. And that definitely sends a signal. And I think the important part as an employee is to try and figure out, like, okay, what signal does this send? If the people are clearly, like, really good performers and they're doing well, then the signal is, holy crap, my job may be at jeopardy. On the other hand, if the people you fire are all as a group kind of like the bottom of people, it can be kind of affirming and a positive thing, saying, okay, we're focusing on the people who are really doing well, and you should feel happy because you're doing well and everything's going to be better in the future and stuff like that. So it's at least worthwhile thinking about, like, okay, what signal does this send if I'm letting go a lot of people all at once? So life after. Some interesting stuff happened. Just doing a lot of the questions of, like, well, what do I do next and stuff. Immediately afterwards, I chatted with former coworkers. I hung in the office for a few hours or something. And what I figured out was the best way to do this was to, say hi to somebody walking by, and, the coworker would come up and then, like, give them a big hug, and I'd whisper in their ear, like, it was nice working with you. I just got fired. And they'd be like, what? And then I'd be like, yeah, cool, huh? And then they'd be like, cool, yeah, do him over there now. And then, and then eventually we had a big pile of people that were all laughing and stuff. It was actually kind of a fun thing. Highly recommend getting fired in that fashion. It was big plus. So that was fun. It was interesting, and definitely, like, people have different experiences on how they exit companies. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be all dreary necessarily. And I liked working with the people that I worked with. So I walked out of the office and decided, at that point, like, all the remote people were starting to find out, so I was getting a lot of text messages and stuff. So instead of going into stuff, I just took a selfie and started sending it out. So this was my selfie immediately after getting fired. And then as I was building this talk, I was like, holy shit, I'm wearing headphones. I wonder what I was listening to. And luckily I'm on Last FM. So I went back and checked, and it was On My Own from Les Miserables. Which, honest to God, it sounds like I'm 14 and just discovering my first breakup or something like that. Like super emo or something. So I found that hilarious. And then I made like a vague tweet, as people do, again, very euphemistic, like, did I quit? Did I get fired or something like that? And that was really weird. But that was fine because I didn't really know how to process things. Again, like in my circumstances, I'd been really deeply involved with the culture and company for a long time. And it was still a bit of a shock. So that was weird. But, things get better and, such is life, and it's not necessarily that big of a deal over time. The last little bits I want to talk about is just loose ends of dealing with termination of a job. If you've never dealt with this sort of stuff before, I was shocked at the amount of work it takes to leave work. I'm still dealing with paperwork and legal stuff and financial stuff from leaving that company. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of things that happen immediately. For one, this computer was bought by GitHub and stuff, and I had all my stuff on there, and I was like, I don't want to turn it back. Like, what do I do with my computer? Do I buy it? Do I have to give it back? All those questions were tricky. I had expenses that, hadn't been reimbursed, and I hadn't expensed yet. And then, on top of that, I was going to, Australia in 2 weeks to basically rep GitHub. And I didn't want to pull out of that because it'd be kind of weird. Would it be fine if GitHub paid for that? And they're like, yeah, that's totally fine. There are all these sorts of things that I was like, oh man, yeah, this is gonna be weird to be up on stage, freshly fired, and give a talk about GitHub and stuff. So there's those things to consider and worry about. If you're a chump American, you have to worry about healthcare. For the few Americans in the room, Cobra's pretty dope, and it will continue your healthcare, so you don't have to worry about that as much right away. Severance definitely varies dramatically from company to company, country to country, person to person. A lot of good companies will give you a number of weeks or months of severance proportional to how long you've been at the company, which has been, that's helpful to have some cash to try and figure out, okay, what am I going to do next? And then the other aspect about this is, at least in the States, I assume it's kind of the same everywhere, separation agreements can be a minefield of hidden problems. So be wary about what you're signing. A lot of things like non-disparagement agreements or non-disclosure agreements are at least important to understand the context of okay, if I sign this, what do I give up, or do I have to worry about stuff? Are there kind of or non-compete stuff wrapped up in that language? These are all good things to have, particularly if you have a lawyer friend or something to give you advice on all this sort of stuff. This is very American-centric, but I know a lot of people will work for American companies. I could go on and on and on about all this stuff, ask me about this stuff later, but there's a 90-day window with specifically stock in American startups that basically after 90 days of leaving a company, your stock can evaporate in some cases, which is terrible, and I can rant about that tonight as the party goes into the night or something. In my case, I basically had 28 hours where they're like, okay, you have to sign the separation agreement or you lose half your stock, which was, initially they told me one thing and that ended up not being the case. So things like that are things that you want to avoid. And that goes into the whole idea of, man, it takes a lot of time and effort and money sometimes to deal with leaving a company, which is not something I had prepared for necessarily. From your perspective, get things in writing as much as possible. It's weird. I've been kind of tutoring people as they get fired the last year. And one person got fired and she was like, oh yeah, they really want me to talk on the phone with the head of legal and just make some agreements and stuff. And I was just like, just do it over email. One, it's easier. No one wants to talk on the phone anyway. But two, there's a lot of stuff that people may say on a phone and then you just, you can't remember it or people forget. And again, you're not in your right state of mind during all of this sort of stuff. So it's totally cool to just say, okay, I understand we can chat on the phone or whatever, but I want everything in writing so I can, at least track back to this in the future. Staying on the record is great. Again, you're dealing with people who've done this considerably more times than you've been fired, most likely. So it's worthwhile to worry about that stuff. And as kind of a general life thing, know a good lawyer, accountant, financial advisor. Maybe not just pay them money, but at least know somebody who can introduce you to these people, because you never know when things will just take a turn and you will be grateful to know somebody who can just ask for actual advice from and not get your advice from idiots on stage at 9 in the morning in Poland. That's me. So life after GitHub, what happened afterwards? What are things that I've been thinking about? GitHub had a very strong culture early on, and that's really hard to kind of separate over time. And part of that was my problem because I would go on stage and do this whole, I had one particular slide where it's like, GitHub is like family and we're there for each other and stuff like that. A company is not a family. I don't know if you noticed this, but like, very rarely can you divorce your brother or like fire your brother or something as much as you want to. And you're like, why are you doing this, Josh? God damn it. But it's cool. Like, your family is good for one thing, and then your company does other stuff. And every time I see somebody say like, oh yeah, we're like a family, we're so close, stuff, it just seems really unhealthy to me at this point. You can be close friends with people, you can be, good coworkers and stuff, but at the end of the day, like, your purpose is to build a company together or build stuff together, and it's fine to just kind of leave it at that and then figure out who are the people that you actually stay in touch with. And that's another kind of interesting part from a coworker perspective. It's cool to stay in touch. I had some disagreements with GitHub, but they're mostly not with the rank and file like the people I worked with every day, obviously. So yeah, it's fine to talk to people and see how they're doing, and hopefully they want to see how I'm doing and stuff. But the interesting part is kind of on you. At least in my case, like once you're out of the company, you kind of lose all of the contact directory and you lose phone numbers and emails and stuff like that. So it's kind of physically hard to get in contact with people unless they kind of reach out to me and do that way. So that was kind of an interesting realization as well. And along these lines, as the company grows, I think it's, depending on the company, but I think it's interesting to have some concept of like alumni of that company, like people who have left and are doing other things and stuff now. This is fantastic. We probably have like 60, we have like a Slack channel just for ex-hubbers where we all kind of congregate and shoot the shit. And some of it's like 60% therapy and like 20% shooting the shit like the old days, and then 20% is all like networking and trying to like move forward, because a lot of people are at really cool companies now and would be more than willing to hire people who had worked with in the past. It's nice to kind of keep that group going, because then it's not just the company you worked for, it's kind of a longer term culture. So we do that. We do like some meetups. This is from a video chat last summer where we got like a bunch of people through weird timelines and stuff to come, time zones and stuff to come together and chat. And it was just kind of cool. And we'll sometimes meet in San Francisco, or I'll see Reg here in Poland, and we'll meet and do a little tiny meetup and stuff. It's interesting. I think this is important because I think what's important at a company is not what you build or weird stuff like that. I think like, not to get really philosophical and stuff, but it's like the mark the company leaves on the world is going to be much stronger through the works that you do after you leave the company. So like, what have you learned from the company that you'll take on to 20 or 30 years from now? And part of that is just keep those connections up. I think that's kind of interesting as well. From an employer perspective, like just have a direct point of communication. Like even a simple like alumni at whatever.com where people can send emails to is fantastic, because after like 3 months, people won't know who's in charge of what anymore. This is really good because sometimes companies will fire their CFO, the head of HR, head of engineering, your manager in like the subsequent months after you left, and then you have no idea who to talk to. So it's totally cool to at least spend a bare minimum of time to set up a email forwarding, so at least you can talk to some of these people about very real stuff like severance or healthcare or other things that they may need in the future. So that's mostly what I want to talk about today. There's a lot of just interesting aspects behind this, and I've been talking about it kind of publicly for a long time, so I get to talk about this privately with a lot more people. And one of the people I talked to, she was like, yeah, I always try to leave a company once I do something amazing at the company, and I just leave right away. Because once you hit that high note, you can never hit that high note again, and you just sort of have small incremental improvements at that point. I don't know if that's right, but I think it's really interesting to think about in terms of like, what is the duration and the tenure at your job, and what do you want out of it? Do you want to like grow quickly by trying a bunch of different things? Do you want to focus on one thing for a long time? All these things are really interesting to think about. Somebody else I talked to privately about all this sort of stuff is Ron Johnson. Ron Johnson, he basically did the Apple stores. Like when they first came out, like he was kind of the designer. He ran that for Apple for a long time. after a while, he ended up switching to be the CEO of JCPenney, which is like a department chain in the States, and did a bunch of really kind of revolutionary changes in the department store area. And either he didn't have enough time to really take over the industry, or they were all stupid ideas. Like whatever side of that you end up on, he ended up getting fired by the board like a year or so later. I was talking to him about all this sort of stuff, and he said a quote that I really like. He said, there's nothing wrong with moving along, regardless of whether it's self-driven or company-driven. Maybe we need new language. Right now, it's either we resign or get fired. Maybe there's a third concept, which is next. I really like that thought. It changes the context of what we view as employment, how we view people who we let go, and how we just kind of work together as an industry. So yeah, think about what's next. And I was really hoping I'd have a much stronger ending. I was doing really well, so that's all I got, so thanks. I don't know what to do now, so I don't know. We doing questions? Sweet. I love questions. Yeah, so the question is like, why even bother too much about all this stuff? Because it's easy to get a job right now in tech, which is true to some extent. It's hard to find that good job, like you mentioned. You never know how the tech is going to go. Like maybe, I don't know if you noticed this, but San Francisco is leading tech right now, and we're doing a lot of really stupid stuff. So it could be we destroy the industry in next year or something, and then this becomes important to realize. The other aspect behind kind of that line of thinking is I suggest people get fired because I talk to a lot of people who are kind of miserable at their, feeling miserable about their jobs, and they're like, okay, I'm going to quit. My manager kind of wants me to quit and stuff. I'm like, just get fired. Just don't work for a couple of weeks, get some severance, and then move on or something. Like, financially, it's good for you. So, yeah, I don't know where to go with that, but yeah, firing is cool, I guess. Any other questions? Yeah.
So, you said a lot about the GitHub culture at the beginning, and this was the same CEO at the beginning, the one who's firing you. Did he kind of move on with the culture change? Did he kind of enjoy it? Because it felt like the culture was the biggest thing.
Yeah, so the question was, same CEO when I started when I was, number 9. It was the same CEO that fired me at 250 or something. And then there's a lot of thoughts about like culture changes and how he was with the culture and how it's changed and stuff. That's obviously a really big discussion and debate and stuff like that. But I'm pretty fine with it. Like GitHub definitely changed dramatically over the years, and it needed to because we kind of hit the point where things were just kind of dysfunctional internally. And there are a lot of ways we could have taken that afterwards. We're like, okay, we're facing severe challenges. We could go this way, or this way, and I was kind of hoping for this way, and it ended up going this way, and that's kind of how things work sometimes. And at the end of the day, like if I weren't fired then, I absolutely would have been fired last year because things are very different from I'm just kind of a small company type of person anyway. So being in a 600-person company seems insane. When I first joined GitHub, I never really thought GitHub would get more than 20 people or something. And once we hit 50 people, I was like, this is the most insane thing I could possibly imagine. Like 50 people all working on one project? Like, this is nuts. And then 250, I was like, holy shit, this is not wild. But so yeah. Yeah. So the question with burnout and is it better to work on one thing for a long time or many things for little times? I'm not sure. There's a really good tweet. The first designer at GitHub was Kyle Neath, and Kyle did this tweet like a year or two ago about, does it make sense? He was basically saying, okay, I've been at GitHub for like 4 or 5 years. Man, I got a lot out of it because I could go really deeply into one problem. I think that's helpful. I think it's also cool to do a bunch of different things and learn that way. So I think the answer is probably both. As it relates to burnout, I think it really depends on what your burnout is. Like for the first month when I was doing stuff, I just sat on the couch and played video games, and that for me that was like a nice, relaxing thing. And then I started doing like weird technology and trying new things, which also helped with all of that sort of stuff too. So it really depends on how things are shaking out for you. Yep. What was that? Yeah, right now I'm not working full time. I'm advising a bunch of startups. One of them is GitLab, so I also support GitLab, who had some amazing ships a couple days ago. So yeah, doing startup advising has been kind of interesting for the same reason, like the burnout question. I've been able to get deeper into a lot more different areas, which has been pretty exciting after working on one thing for like 5 years and only doing like dev tools and revision or version control and stuff. Done some consulting and stuff like that, but mostly just been hacking on something else the last few months. So we'll see how things go with that. Is that it, or? It's hard to, okay, cool.